Mach 3, give me Crucio on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, X1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 2, Mach 9.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and Crucio on 7 and 9.
Line 1, Crucio 7 and 9, Mach 9.
Do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, Reservoir Avionics.
Super Ops. Line 7 is code 3 for Flickas.
Hey, so I started a Patreon because, frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. This month's top-tier Patreon shoutout goes to Robbie Walker, Travis Barnes, Kevin Traw, and JT Owens. Thanks for the support. The following is not legal advice, nor is it medical advice, and shouldn't be treated as such. Okay, so today we're joined by someone who's been on the podcast before in episode 13, Dr. Smith, and today's topic is going to be pregnancy in the military, both before and after birth, with an eye specifically towards mental health, what the military does right, what the military maybe does wrong, and then also, the experiences of women serving and pregnancy, because the reality is what I very much learned in the women in maintenance discussion was that I really probably didn't have a good grasp of what women go through in the military. And that was just through the eye of work and maintenance. And then when we kind of tie in the entire creating a human life in your body and all the physiological and mental and emotional sort of aspects of that, I think it's important for us to kind of explore that. And this is going to be run in conjunction with an interview with a OBGYN resident as well, talking about the physical part. So first of all, Dr. Smith, thank you very much for coming back on. I appreciate it. And if you could just refresh the listeners for what your professional credentials and background is.
Okay, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I actually was in the Air Force for 6 years, and then I worked as a contractor for another, I should know this, a long time. Let me do the math. 13 years, something like that.
So that's like a combined 19 years working in the mental health field with service members and veterans. Does that sound right?
That sounds about right. Yep.
So that's a lot. And you served, and if I remember correctly, you were also a new mother, or pregnant and a new mother while you were in the Air Force, correct?
That is true. I had 2 children I was served for 6 years, and I had 2 children during that time.
Okay. So I solicited some questions from some groups that I've gotten here today, and I've passed them along to you, just there's no surprises. But I guess I'm going to start with, I think a lot of men may not understand the effects that a miscarriage will have on a woman.
I think a lot of people don't understand that unless they've maybe had one themselves. I have to agree with that. So what I do know about miscarriage is that it's quite common.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had heard it was up to 1 in 4 pregnancies. I think that's actually true. I think it's more like 1 in 8 documented, but they think there was even more than that are
mm-hmm.
maybe never reported or maybe undetected even by the mother. So it's incredibly common. And there's reasons for that. I know biologically there's reasons for that. Maybe your OBGYN friend will hit on that more for me. But I mean, scientifically speaking, they think that a lot of those miscarriages are a result of the fetus is not developing properly, or the embryo is not developing properly. And it's nature's way of for aborting a problematic pregnancy. But it's emotionally devastating for mothers. I do know that as well.
So I imagine that emotional devastation probably varies depending on how far along the pregnancy is. Because I imagine, like, if it's like very late in the pregnancy, you've already had a baby shower, you've bought things, you've told people, you've picked out names, and then you have a miscarriage, like at or near term, like I imagine that's a radically different experience emotionally than if it was right after a pregnancy test in the first month or two, and then the fetus is passed, almost without medical intervention, right?
Yeah, I think that's fairly obvious, or I shouldn't say obvious, but I think that's readily apparent because the longer you're pregnant, the more attached you are to it. And I think the more people know, the more, you have to account to people sort of, but I actually think that's part of the problem is that miscarriage is like a secret and almost like a shameful secret. I don't know quite why that is, but I think that's part of what makes it problematic is that people feel ashamed of it. I think a lot of moms worry that they did something wrong or it's their fault that they miscarried a baby. So obviously, yeah, I think it is a different experience when it's really late term, but it's really very painful at any point, or it can be. And I think society really discounts and discards that in a very unfortunate way. People don't feel like they can talk about it, and people, I think, that are naive sort of poo-poo it, especially if it's early in the pregnancy.
Yep. And I wonder, you kind of touched on it briefly, but how often and how severe is the woman's guilt and where the woman feels responsible for that miscarriage?
I just think that is a very kind of normal experience for a woman.
So too.
I don't know. Part of being a woman for a lot of women is being able to carry a baby. And you've already had that positive pregnancy test. And probably no matter whether you plan to get pregnant or not, probably by this point, you're kind of excited about it or looking for it. You've started to project forward into that future where you're going to have a baby and you're going to bring it home from the hospital. So then to lose it is, it's disorienting. And I think it's just a natural experience to assume it's because you've done something wrong. And I just don't think as a society, I don't think we do a good job with that. As a military, we probably don't do a great job with that. And I don't think the medical system does a great job with that. I'm going to share my own experience because I think it should be destigmatized. So I did have a miscarriage between my two children. So it was early and I had been trying to get pregnant for quite a long time. So I was excited about it. And then very early on, I started to bleed and I knew that could not be a good thing, that probably meant I was no longer pregnant. But I went to the emergency room and the doctor, he was an older man and he was kind, but he didn't spend much time worrying about my emotional aspect of it. He just kind of told me like, yeah, we ran the test. We confirmed you did lose the pregnancy. You'll be fine. Go on home and try again, sort of thing. And I ruminated about it for weeks, probably. Like, why did it happen? Did I do something wrong? Is it because I lifted this? Is it because I moved that? Is it because I went to exercise? What did I do wrong? So I set up an appointment and I wanted to get pregnant again. So I set up an appointment with OBGYN and I thought they were initially very dismissive. Like, oh, you don't need to come in for that. That's normal. We don't want to, sort of the message I got was we don't want to burn one of our appointments on that. And I was like, I have questions and I want a doctor to address them and I want to see an expert. So they did schedule me to go in and he was kind and he gave me good information and he reassured me that it was not my fault. And it's not, I believe after all my research that it's really not a woman's fault. It's something that happens naturally. But I found the system to be not very sympathetic, not very compassionate. And I think it's difficult in the military too. I'll share this. If you're in the military and you, as a woman and you find out that you're pregnant, the first thing they tell you as soon as your positive pregnancy test comes back is that you have to go tell your boss, your immediate supervisor. Maybe that's great for some women. It wasn't great for me at the time. My boss was a man. He and I didn't have a good relationship. I didn't want to tell him yet. It was so early in my pregnancy, but I had to go tell him. And I think he was fine about it, but his basically like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like, am I supposed to make accommodations for you? Or what am I supposed to do with this information? I'm like, I don't know. They told me to tell you. I'm telling you.
And that's wild too, because in your role, you were in a mostly office setting, correct? Which means besides a possible reduction in hours later in your pregnancy, depending on if you had any sort of complications or required a lighter sort of workload.
100%. I think the only thing that would change is I couldn't be on mobility status. Yeah.
Right. Whereas, when I view it through the lens of a maintainer, when a woman in maintenance gets that pregnancy test and she goes to his boss, she's basically having to tell her boss, I'm cutting your available resources for the mission by whatever my percentage value is, if that makes sense.
I know, I'm sure it is, right? So I'm sure it's not enthusiastically received. Yeah, I'm sure it's much more difficult for people on the line. I'm going to completely acknowledge that, because they can't do their work anymore, and now you've got to find another role for them. And yeah, so then when I miscarried a few weeks later, they told me, now you got to go back to your boss and tell him you're not pregnant, and that's terrible. That was terrible. So I don't know what the answer is for that.
How was his reception when you told him? Because you worked in mental health, which means your boss was very likely somebody that had a medical and or maybe a mental health background. How did he?
He did nothing. That's not surprising to me. But he and I just didn't have a good relationship. I mean, he wasn't cold. I mean, he wasn't
right.
He wasn't terrible, but he was just like, okay, thanks for letting me know. And that was about it. Go on back to work. And I do think that's an opportunity that the military should take advantage of. I was thinking about it in preparation for this podcast. I'm sure or you probably know, that when there's a traumatic event on base and the mental health team responds to it, one of the things they offer that they don't offer very often in the military is 3 free visits. You can go to a military, mental health specialist for 3 visits, and it's not going to be documented. And I think they should do something similar for miscarriage. It's not, it would be you having a normal grief experience, or probably any loss. You're having a normal grief reaction. It would be helpful to talk to someone. It doesn't need to be, life-changing or life-altering. Let them go talk to someone for a few times without having to worry about the possibly career impact of it.
And when you were talking about your miscarriage, you said one of the first things you did was review all of your behaviors during the pregnancy to see if those were maybe the source of the cause of the miscarriage. And I think that's also a broader symptom of society, where both through what we do in society plus the commercial corporate aspect of pregnancy, where, mothers to be, pregnant women are very much, whether they feel it or if it's justified that they feel it, this is actually, projected onto them. Society views all of their behavior as a pregnant woman through a very judgmental sort of lens, that somehow I think society thinks that if you follow this perfect recipe of, you don't lift up the heavy things, you don't have any caffeine, you can't have any of this, you can't, all the myriad of daily things that non-pregnant people interact with every day, that now all of a sudden a pregnant woman is restricted to. I think it would be hard pressed to find any woman while pregnant that perfectly adhered to all of the scientific literature for how to best protect your baby, and then coupled with the social sort of judgment against them when they're not perfect. And then you add on the miscarriage. That's a huge psychological burden to put on someone. I just imagine it'd be almost impossible for the woman not to feel that they were somehow to blame.
That was like you said, that was my first reaction, was to review what I must have done to cause it. And I suspect it must be even more difficult for your women that work on the line, where is it because I was exposed to this, because I breathed in this fume, because because they have much more kind of, physically engaging jobs perhaps. So I just, it's, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be improved. I do think societally, I've seen signs of improvement here recently. I'm not a celebrity worshiper, but I think they really can play a role in shaping how we react to things. And you probably know that Chrissy Teigen and her husband, John Legend, recently had a late term, loss of a child. And they took pictures and they shared their story. And I thought that was profound, and it's hopefully going to have an incredible impact on society for people to be more educated and more sensitive to this topic. And then Meghan Markle and Prince Harry did the same. They had a miscarriage and they shared their experience. So I'm glad to see that the dialogue's increasing around this topic. I think the military especially has an opportunity, because they know when their people are pregnant. And when their people have lost a pregnancy, and would be a great thing to at least refer them for a few free sessions and let them talk to someone and then they could train up their mental health staff as well to make sure that they're providing good information.
And I think the military also kind of views pregnancy through a different lens in the civilian sector. Like, the military, they put you on a profile, and it's almost you're not 100% anymore. And the woman, like you said, you were no longer on mobility status. Like, I feel like, and I don't know if there's a better way, but in the civilian sector, being pregnant is a medical condition, but it's not like a medical disability, I'll say. And it feels like the military treats pregnancy as a temporary disability. Does that make sense to you?
It 100% does, because I'll relate another story for that. When I was pregnant, I was applying for some sort of status change. It's hard to explain it because I don't remember it that well myself, but it was going from like a conditional commission to a long-term and indefinite commission. And it's something you have to apply for after a few years. So I applied for it, and they turned me down because I was on profile for being pregnant. And I was like, well, that's definitely not an indefinite profile.
Wow.
Like, that will eventually end no matter what. And I still had to wait till I was off profile for being pregnant. I remember just thinking that was bizarre, and I still think that's bizarre. Yeah,
that's a really weird way to view it, right? And it's very, I don't know, it's unempathetic, or it's almost flipping you're creating a human being on its head to, while you're creating a human being, you're a detriment to the mission. And we need to code you in such a way so that way we don't accidentally expect a normal amount from you. And I just feel like it's a huge ego shot. And I mean, ego's not even the right word. It's like a self-worth and value judgment just because. And then look at there's obviously two kinds of, there's the unintentional pregnancy and the intentional pregnancy. And, you know, I wonder what a woman goes through when they're planning to get pregnant. What is the internal dialogue going on of, well, you know, I have this TDY coming up, so I don't want to be pregnant during that. So and I just think that is just a bizarre place to be mentally. And I think it automatically frames pregnancy.
I think it is unfortunate in the military. I've heard people say in the military, she got pregnant to avoid this or avoid that. And that's incredibly insulting. It is.
I just don't think, I mean, it goes back to, you know, I have the benefit of never have I had to experience these sorts of things, because all of my profiles involve some sort of injury or, you know, like something that I knew wasn't necessarily my fault. And it just seems really wild that the military treats a pregnancy as a disability, and then it
and like you said, with the burden of
fault, kind of
being perceived in their job as being a burden, or, you know, not contributing any longer while they're pregnant. I'm curious, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. So what kind of roles do they give women on the flight line when they're pregnant?
So I think, first of all, I think they're not as good a roles as they should be. And when I talk to the OBGYN in the companion episode, I hope to address it. But very often, and also like with every episode of this podcast, if I'm off or I'm not accurately representing what you're experiencing as a woman, please, you know, I welcome you to chime into the comments, because this isn't about me saying what the gospel is, more about me learning and understanding so that other people can as well. But in my experience, they would put women in debrief. So that's where, you know, the pilots come in after they flew a sortie, and they basically, you know, how long did they fly, who flew, and then if there's any discrepancies and there's a maintainer sitting there, typically they're on profile. So it's very often populated by pregnant women. And if there aren't pregnant women, then it would be, you know, somebody else happens to be on a profile for whatever other medical reason. And, you know, my thoughts are, to me, that doesn't seem very far removed from the toxins of the flight line, because the pilots are coming in they have jet exhaust kind of on their clothing, or maintainers are coming in to talk to the pilots in debrief about what they heard. Like, oh, well, you told me on the spot it was this. I need to come in and get more information. Those maintainers, if it's a crew chief, they might be bringing in jet fuel that kind of in their uniform from maintenance they did earlier in the day, or they're in coveralls they haven't washed in a week or two. So there's probably chemicals and stuff on there. Or I think sometimes the women work in the support section, like the tool room, and there's still hazardous chemicals there, typically locked up, but they're still around. And it just really makes me think that, and I almost always go back and blame resource restriction. I'm not sure if I'm just beating a dead horse or if I'm too narrow in my understanding of things, but like when you're resource restricted, you still need to get certain things done. So if you have a able-bodied person in the tool room, you can swap them out to the flight line. You can put that pregnant woman in the tool room, and you feel like you're getting both needs met at the same time with very little detriment to the mission. But I think what happens is those chemicals are still around. I think the women are really, they feel like they're asking too much just being taken off the line anyway. There's automatically the shame and guilt associated with, I'm not carrying the same load as the other people that share my AFSC in this unit. So when they go into those areas that very well might have some exposure to those chemicals, certainly to a lesser degree than the line, I imagine they probably still shouldn't be around them, but I think a lot of them don't speak up because it's almost like an internal compromise of, well, at least I'm not around it all the time, and I'm still supporting the mission in some way, and this is the best they can do, which goes back to our conversation about miscarriage. Because if that woman goes into debrief and every once in a while she's exposed to a dirty maintainer that smells like jet fuel or anything else, or in support section where they're applying Loctite or petrolatum or whatever it might be through basic, part of their job, and then they miscarriage, how are they not going to internalize responsibility for that miscarriage? Because they knew when they were handling those chemicals, they probably shouldn't, but they were afraid to speak up because they felt like they were already taking too much away from others. And then they have a miscarriage. Like, I just feel like very often in the military, and especially in aircraft maintenance, we make mothers choose between the health of their child and their loyalty to the mission. And I think it's really unfair.
I agree. I think we need to do better. And I'm sure there's an opportunity to do better. I'm not an expert on a flight line, but there must be roles that are removed from the toxins that are critical, that are imperative, where people really feel like they're continuing to make a contribution, where you could train people to rotate in and out. I just think they can do a better job with that for sure.
I'm sure there are. And then, go ahead.
Maybe it's not really within the squadron. Maybe it's something that benefits base command or even the hospital, but something where they can be making a real contribution, but they are protected from toxins and from other things that they would need to worry about.
Yeah. And then I also think there's a legitimate career impact as well. I mean, a woman that works debrief, it's really hard to get competitive achievements to somebody that's out pulling engines and troubleshooting complex faults, and somebody that's just doing data entry inside, and you're going to be judged against them.
100%. I have long thought that it's almost impossible to be a mother and to do well in the military. I always reflect on the people that have been my commander. Even in the medical field, you see a lot more female commanders probably, but almost every high-ranking female commander that I know did not have children.
Yep.
I think the military just demands a lot from their people in general. And I think for a man who has maybe a stay-at-home wife or a wife that can take on more of the load at home, they can do it. But a woman, it's just, I don't know that you can have children and really progress that far in the military. It's hard to do.
Well, and I think it's also, I mean, maybe not like if I was married to a maintainer, I think this probably wouldn't be the case. But, I was married to a civilian, and I'm not sure if I was explicitly told at work or if just I knew. But I told her, I was like, hey, my job is going to come first because like if I say no, I go to prison.
Right.
Like that doesn't exist in your job. And my job has shift changes and it's going to have all these things. Like I'll help out where I can. But the reality is if my job says something, if my job and your job are in competition for us for time or shift or whatever, my job's just going to come first. And that's a really difficult. And I would like to think I didn't do it because I thought as a man it was more important, but it was very much I don't have any flexibility here in this constraint. I would gladly like to take time off, but also I just imagine what did that communicate to my wife?
Yes.
Like that's a huge hit, and it's really, and it's like I don't know, I feel bad. I feel like it was outside of my control, but I just feel bad. Like that's a really terrible place.
Again, this is a societal problem, and it's very true in the military. Because of the recent Me Too movement and even the recent Black Lives movement, I think I've been thinking a lot more about privilege-dominated societies where we can be privileged in a lot of ways, but definitely there's male privilege. And it still dictates a lot of things in society. Even if you didn't think it in your head, there's no doubt someone within your chain of command probably would have thought it in their head that, like, well, yeah, you don't stay home with the kids because you're the man. Like that's something the little wife does.
Yeah. I mean, the real test with that is if you had two aircraft maintainers of the same skill level, it'd be an interesting experiment of which one stays home.
Right.
And I'd still imagine it'd probably be the man just because of that traditional gender roles and stuff.
Right. Well, the man would go to work and the woman would.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So also, a lot of my experience is on the outside looking in. But I'd like to think I pay attention enough to be able to spot these things. But it seems like postpartum depression is much more widespread than what a lot of people are led to believe. Like I believe, and I hope you'll either correct me if I'm wrong or support my hypothesis. I think postpartum depression is the norm. And if you don't have postpartum depression, I think that is the outlier. And I think society flips that where they think postpartum is the outlier and being normal after birth is the norm.
I happen to agree with you based on my experiences in the field and in my life. It's funny, I was just going to use the same word, that I think it's the norm to some degree. Whether or not you meet full criteria for like a major depressive episode, maybe not, but having some sort of postpartum baby blues is the norm. Again, I think it's, under realized, under addressed. And that's a concern. I think for a lot of women, based on my experience, especially with the first child, there's definitely a hormonal impact, 100%, which, I can attest to because it's a very strange thing. Early on, after my first child was born, I was tearful all the time, but I didn't feel sad, but I felt out of control emotionally. And I know that was the hormones. But for moms, especially first-time moms, I think being a mom is an incredible responsibility. Yeah. People appreciate that, and they want to do their very best at it. I've often said parenting is the one thing people will not give themselves a break on. You make a mistake parenting and you just flagellate yourself, whereas other things you could probably accept, like you're not perfect. But people want to be perfect parents. And so just a lot of pressure. Like you're a new parent. You've really had very little training in parenting. You know very little about it. They send you home with a tiny baby who really relies on you for everything. And you feel, that you're unqualified for it. And it makes you anxious and depressed.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I wonder how much of postpartum depression just has to deal with the idea or the feeling of being completely overwhelmed and unprepared. I
think that's a big part of it. I think that's the majority of it in my experience, but then the hormones don't help as well. Yep. I do understand that since my time in the service, actually, I think they did implement this while I was a contractor. They started giving men paternity leave. Yep. Can you tell me how much it is? Do you know?
So fathers get 21 days, mothers get 42 days of maternity leave that's not charged, and they also get another 42 days of convalescent leave, totaling 12 weeks for the mother. And I think it gets a little bit longer, obviously, for a C-section because it's more of a convalescent leave.
Yeah.
But now men can get that is usable within the first year after the child is born.
That's fantastic. I think that's a huge improvement since when I was pregnant. When I was pregnant, the woman got 6 weeks, 8 if it was a C-section, and the man got none. And that's just, it still strikes me as a short period of time. Having said that, I will say that's more than most jobs give.
Yep.
Most jobs, you take your own leave, you can burn your own leave, but they don't give you anything for free. So it is a nice gift, but it still seems quite short because after that, you don't have the option of taking more time or taking FMLA or something like that.
And I think that's the piece there too. Like, yes, it's more than most civilian jobs give, but other civilian jobs will let you take a day off short notice because you have an appointment and you get more flexibility and control, and your work-life balance is typically better because you don't have weekend duties, you don't have constant shift rotations, you don't have deployments. Like, I mean, think about it. The military requires you to have a family care plan of here's the person that's going to take my child short term, like up to 2 weeks. And then here's the person that's going to take my child long term up to a year. Because by the way, the military might send, for dual military couples or a single military parent, they might send you to a remote assignment for a year where they say, hey, you don't get to have your kid for a year. And you need to figure out your person ahead of time. And oh, by the way, if you don't have a family care plan, then the commander, it's on a slide and the first sergeant chases you down if you're enlisted, probably maybe even for officer, I don't know. But they chase you down and go, hey, what are you doing to take care of your kid in the event we got to send you somewhere because we don't want to have to deal with your family stuff while we're trying to get you an assignment or a deployment or something. And that's a very, it's just like the military creates this stigma that pregnancy and your children are such an inconvenience to what they want to do, that they are counterproductive to the mission.
Yes, 100%. That's why, frankly, I got out of the service was because I did not, just after I had children, I realized that my children were going to come first and I needed to get out of the service because when you're in the service, your command expects the service to come first. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, I think to some degree that has to be true, but there's definitely a dichotomy. You got to choose, and it's unfortunate.
You know what I would say? I think you're right. I think there are times it has to come first, but I think the problem with the military is they abuse that priority for everything. Like, if it's a short notice thing that has to happen and you're the only qualified person, you got to get it done. Yeah, it's totally appropriate for you to pack your shit and go. But if it's like, hey, you're overdue for your info protection training and we're going to drag you in this weekend. You're like, well, I had plans to go with my kids to the water park this weekend. We already bought the tickets. We're like, well, I guess you should have thought of that before you let your info protection training lapse. So you need to get this done first and maybe next time you'll know better. It's like, is a stupid CBT more important than like the fact that you've been working 12s for the last month and you finally get a time to spend time with your kids and let them know that they are still a very important part of your life and you want to be around them, you just can't. And then they're going to drag you away from that. Like that's where that power dynamic that the military uses of the mission over family, that's where it becomes where you chase people like you out of the military because you know that your time isn't yours and they will flex that authority for anything because there's no check. There's no accountability for overuse of that.
I agree. And I've seen it be abused. I mean, I've met plenty of people where they have a sick child or sick caregiver, like maybe their daycare provider's sick and they have to, things you can't plan for. And I've heard it from multiple people that some bosses come back with, well, execute your child, care plan. It's like, well, that's not really what that's designed for. That's not designed for these short notice things that come up occasionally in life.
I'll tell you what, I saw it at the beginning of the pandemic where like you had dual military couples, the CDC is now closed. So kids are staying home. And I can't remember where I saw it, but I wasn't surprised by it, which I think speaks volumes. That some supervisor had said, that's why you have a family care plan. And it's like, it is a pandemic. No one is able to watch your kids because asymptomatic people are spreading a deadly respiratory virus. Like at this point, you need to not think the family care plan is the answer here, because by the way, that would have to be everyone. And we're just shifting kids around. Like that doesn't make any sense. But the fact that they immediately went to the family care plan as a solution to a global pandemic, just because they wanted this person to come into work. And it's just like, I just feel like, people in the military, because of their power and what they can do, it doesn't require empathy. It doesn't require consideration. It doesn't require
Even
understanding the complexities of life, because there's a very rigid rule set that they can pull those levers, and you will get your person to come into work. There's no out. There's no justification if you so choose. And I think that really screws up how we relate to each other in the military.
I agree with you. And I think the military has now at this point, or at least last time I was with them, gotten to the point, that the military started cutting personnel, but without cutting what their mission. Mm-hmm. So it was always, we're going to do more with less. We're going to do more with less. And that's just become the new norm, I think, doing more with mm-hmm. less. So you're really, like you said, working 12-hour days used to be the exception, and now it's sort of become the rule. And I just think that's a terrible way to run a business, basically, and a terrible way to treat your people. And just because you can make them work overtime doesn't mean you should be doing that on the regular.
Yeah, I brought that up in episode 31. Where I was talking about when you're at a factory and you're making like 100 license plates and you get 100 metal, scrap metal, value of 100 scrap metal coming in to make 100 license plate. You can make 100 license plates all day long. But if you reduce the scrap metal coming into 50, there's not a company, factory, a corporation out there that goes, well, I still expect you to make 100 license plates. Like if you reduce the resource in, you have to expect a reduction in the productive output. But the military doesn't see that way, because the reality is there's a very malleable and variable, which is the human element and the human contribution and the time that person can spend making up for a lack of resources. And that's where the whole mantra of failure is not an option becomes a thin veneer of abuse, where, yeah, mission failure isn't an option, because what you're doing is when you under-resource, you defer that failure to the individual. You make them work 15 hours a day. You make them skip the gym so that way they can work longer or extra. They're just so wore out from their shift, they can't even muster the energy to go to the gym, where they're working long hours off shift and they don't even want to make a medical appointment for their knee problem or their shoulder problem, because they don't feel like getting up 3 hours after they go to bed when they know they have a 15-hour shift that night. Nobody can afford to let them off. And anniversaries are missed, and those weekend at the water park is missed because you didn't do your info protection training, and they drag you in because you couldn't do the training because you're working 15 hours getting jets fixed. So it's like the aggregate of that resource restriction to the military, it seems like, well, as it ebbs and flows, we still get this productive output. But what they're missing is they are laying that stress of the resource restriction on the individual, and it's grinding people up, both in their mental health. I argued that I would be interested to see, metrics of fleet health, like how good is the fleet? What is our sortie production? How many sorties are we flying? Because if that's staying static and our fleet's getting older and our manning drew down and our experience drew down, and then we're demanding a readiness of the fleet that we haven't met in 9 years, and we have a short notice requirement to get the fleet ready when you have an already overtaxed personnel and maintenance. I imagine the alcohol-related incidents trended up, the DUIs trended up, the mental health referrals trended up, the Article 15s for behavioral issues trended up. And it just seems, and by AFSC, I'm willing to bet that if somebody somewhere got together, okay, these are the AFSCs that have been going to mental health over the last 10 years. Where does this have an uptick? Where does the ARIs have an uptick? ADAP uptick, all these things uptick. I bet you would see it coincide with force shaping and mandates for readiness coupled with sorority production. And it really drives me insane. And I said this in episode 31, there's no way a master sergeant who was only at the tactical level, who spent most of his career in ATC, there's no way that I'm the only one that has thought of this or presented this theory. There had to have been somebody in a position of authority at the Pentagon that has been looking at this. And if they're not, that strikes me as criminally negligent, which, isn't going to be a thing here. But if they haven't, it's so negligent. And if they have, I'm not sure if that's better or worse.
I think they need to turn it around. I'll say this. I think it's become so institutionalized. It's just become institutionalized. Like, that is the military way. People get it in their head that that's the way things are. They don't even think to challenge it anymore. And I fear that that's even true for our leaders at the highest levels. Just this military culture of just always saying, yes, sir, right away, sir.
Yep.
And never really kind of pushing back on, some requests are too much, you're pushing your people too hard. Even to bring it back to the idea of pregnancy, if you know that 10% of your personnel, say, or 12% are female, and that they're all in childbearing, years of their life, and that most of them are going to get pregnant at some point, you should be taking that into account. And you should,
for your manning, yeah,
Phil, and you should expect they're going to go out on a regular basis, and you should not make them feel badly about it. You should incorporate it, and you should make it work for your company.
Boy, I would love to get this answer. I wonder if manning accounts for the fact that, because the reality is women in the military are essentially all, or 99% in the childbearing years.
Yes.
You're talking 17 and a half to 40 is the typical 20-year hack for an enlisted person. Right. And then, you're talking menopause can not kick in till 50 yes. or something, So you're looking at a 33-year hack of the most, fertile time. And you're right. If women account for this percentage of the population, especially by AFSC, does manpower account for 33% of these women at any given time are going to be either pregnant or recently given birth and breastfeeding, and therefore restricted from participating in this. And therefore, we need to man this career field with these many more people. So that way, when these women are out because of pregnancy, we're still at the target population we're looking for. And if for whatever reason they don't get pregnant, great. We have extra people that can do extra things, and we're going to be more productive, and it's going to be better. I would like to think they do that. And what I will say is I literally didn't consider it till you brought it up, which makes me suspect the manpower doesn't do that.
I think they don't do that. I suspect they don't do that. So my husband is a civilian and has always been a civilian. So at his work, like most civilian jobs, when you work overtime, you get paid more. So guess what they try to do? They try to limit overtime. And if people are doing too much overtime at his job, people are going to start looking into that. That's a bad thing. Because, I think it's to protect their dollar, but, we don't want to be paying overtime. And I think it's the opposite in the military, but they should be measuring that. It should be a metric, and it should be considered a bad metric. If you're routinely working your people over 8 hours, then something's wrong and you need to fix it.
So in aircraft maintenance, and I'm sure there's enough big brain people in the comments that are going to come on off the top rope and cut me down. But in aircraft maintenance, there's very much a mantra that the time you document in IMDS, which is the information management database system, or information, anyway, it's CAMS. It's how you document your maintenance, all the things you've done. The idea is, or the argument is, because we as maintainers don't document all of our time appropriately, the Air Force claims they can't see how much we're overworked, which absolves the Air Force of responsibility for accurately resourcing us. And I'll tell you what, when you're so resource restricted that you are doing your IMDS, your documentation at your 13-hour mark, when you're at your wits' end and exhausted, your motivation is, what do I need to put into this stupid computer to satisfy the aircraft records so I can go home and sleep? You're not like, well, I need to make sure I enter this special convoluted code for how long it took me to sign out tools, or how long I researched a part, or how long I did all these things. It's just everything takes 5 minutes. Everything takes 30 minutes. And you're just plugging it in, you're getting it done, and you're sending it off. And I would like to think that the Air Force, it feels like victim blaming. And victim is probably not the right word here, but if the Air Force is under-resourcing people and then blaming them for not accurately describing how miserable their existence is as a justification for plausible deniability of the Air Force's mismanagement of resource and personnel, that is offensive to my conscience.
I agree. And I think this idea of like wartime, ops tempo is you just can't rely on that. For how long have we been at war?
Where are we at? 20 years?
Yeah. I mean,
2001. Yeah.
You can't do that indefinitely. You can't wear your people out like that.
Yeah. But also bringing it back around to pregnancy, and I guess how stressed out, I just can't, aircraft maintenance specifically, but military service in general is a stressful endeavor anyway. That's why there's like so many people can't do it, or so many people leave early, or so many people leave with, mental health sort of disabilities through the VA system. I imagine all of that weighing on a person while pregnant, because pregnancy is already a stressful thing. A woman is like, especially the first pregnancy, I imagine there's just all this self-doubt. There's all of this apprehension. I remember my ex-wife, she was like, I literally don't know how this is going to come out of there. Like, I don't understand how that's going to work. I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah. And then you tack on all of the military stress on top of it, coupled with the guilt of you're not carrying an equal load to your teammates. I can't imagine that pressure. Like, individually, those are both high pressure situations, but when you stack them on top of each other, I just imagine a lot of pregnant women in the military just feel like it's an impossible condition.
I think so. I think it's a lot of stress. I think being pregnant in general is stressful. It's a lot. And like you said, especially with your first pregnancy, I think to be in a job that really doesn't sort of celebrate pregnancy. In fact, it's maybe somewhat the opposite, is unfortunate. And then I do think it's really hard even after you've had the child. I mean, finding childcare, especially childcare that will accommodate maybe crazy hours, and childcare that's going to take your child pretty much no matter what, because if your child's sick, you still have to go to work. If your child, is fussy or whatever it is, you still have to go to work. So I remember finding childcare was hugely stressful. And as I mentioned, I didn't have the option to say to work, like, hey, I'm going to take a few weeks off because I'm in between childcare, or I don't know. I also wanted to, I have a few things from my own experience. Go ahead. Because of my position, I had to pull call I think it was like every 4 or 5 weeks. And I'm a nonner, so I shouldn't complain about this to line people, but pulling call could be a lot of extra hours. And sometimes I could be in the ER all night or most of the night. And so they did, back then, they gave us comp time for it. But it was hour for hour. You kept time, not the step time you were on the phone, obviously, but if you were in your uniform, boots on the ground in the ER, you got comped out for that. So during my whole first pregnancy, I saved up my comp hours. this is, I'm pulling call while I'm pregnant, which isn't ideal, but I'm going to save all these hours, and this will be more time for me to spend with the baby when the baby comes. So I had about 40 hours saved up, and I negotiated with my boss. This is something I thought was genius. I still think it's great. When I first came back to work, I wanted to come back half days, and it would provide a better transition for both me and the baby to kind of get for both of us to adjust. And my immediate boss at that time was, I guess I had 2 different bosses during 2 different pregnancies, but this boss was supportive, and he thought that was reasonable. And so we worked it out. But then his boss became aware of it. And not only did they say no, but they took away all my comp time. Like, they just took it away. So I don't know.
So when I look at all of this conversation in one, like just trying to wrap my mind around all of this experience, both as a woman in the military plus a pregnancy in the military, the only word that comes to mind is this environment is hostile to women, is what it feels like. And I'm not going to say hostile broadly, like they hate women, but all the things that you're describing, all the things we talked about, a man does not experience those things, doesn't have any adverse effects from those things, doesn't have to even consider those things in order to succeed in their career or anything. Where the military has built an environment that the only woman that doesn't experience these is, like you said, elects not to have children.
Correct. So I'm going to mention one other anecdote. It's painful for me to talk about, actually, but with my first child, when I went out on maternity leave, and when I came back, I was hoping to come back to half days, and that got kiboshed. But when I came back, I was out for 6 weeks. During that time, they had reorganized my element, and another employee he was junior to me. He was the same rank, but he was junior in rank to me. And I had been his supervisor when I went out on maternity leave. When I came back, he was now my supervisor. And let me be clear, I had done nothing wrong. The only thing I had done was have a baby. And I was punished for it, and I was humiliated for it. And then I went to go talk to the IG about that because I just thought that was wrong. Maybe the IG wasn't the right person in retrospect. I think it probably should have been equal opportunity, probably is who I should have talked to. But not only was IG not supportive, but they called my command, and then I got in trouble for going to the IG. And what I can say is I've had lots of jobs now, and I have always been recognized for being hardworking, nose to the grindstone. I've always been dedicated to my job. In fact, I think I think I'm a workaholic, and I think that's a bit of a problem, but I tend to prioritize my job. But I just want to be clear. I did nothing wrong except for go out and have a baby. And I definitely got punished for it.
You know, I've known you for a long time, so I have no doubt that that's true. And and what signal does that send to you? Because that was after your first child, right?
Yes.
So, as you got pregnant for the second time, in the back of your mind, I'm sure you thought, what career advancement am I going to have to sacrifice for this time?
Well, if I'm being honest, I already knew I was getting out. I was scheduled to be out before then. I was scheduled to get out in October of 2001, and then September 11th happened, and I didn't get out. But yeah, as soon as that happened to me, that experience with my first child, I was out. I punched out, but I didn't get out as soon as I had hoped because of September 11th.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you wouldn't. So I mean, you've said before that part of the reason that motivated you to leave the military was that you found this tension between your role as a mother and having a family, and how it was really not compatible with military service. And I wonder if there was a better environment for it, and you felt secure that your career would not be sidelined because of just this role of being a mother. I wonder if you would have stayed in.
Yeah, I don't know. I suspect I probably wouldn't have, but that expedited it for sure. I mean,
that makes sense.
Actually very painful to talk about. I still feel hurt by that. And in that case, yeah, I was mistreated, and fortunately I was able to, I had an opportunity to get out at least. I didn't have 5 more years on my contract or something like that. I did at least have that option. I can't imagine how stuck I would have felt if I owed a lot more time.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's really powerful that you point out you still feel hurt by that after all these years later, that it was just this egregious sort of harm, and, part of the reason this topic came up was just because I didn't understand the woman's experience, and I solicited a lot of questions from women to get their perspective and also figure out what they wanted to know about. But you saying that you're hurt by it, but also us exploring what specifically in the military sort of culture perpetuated that hurt. Ideally, someone is going to listen to this and digest it, internalize it, and maybe apply some fixes or something going forward. I mean, that's my hope for every podcast, is someone with some level of clout or authority can hear this information, this unfiltered information, and do something with it. But I think what you've also done here is all those women that ask the questions that we kind of work through today, it's probably really helpful for them to hear you work through these things, and also that you are experiencing the same emotions they probably are, and giving a voice to their struggles. So while it sucks to kind of reopen that emotional wound from many, many years ago, I think it lends a lot of weight to what you're saying here today. And I appreciate it. And I kind of also appreciate your willingness to open that wound back up. Like, that's not easy. And, I can speak for whoever's listening. I think we all appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It is still hard to talk about. But I got to thinking about it, that if that happened to me, and I mean, I was an officer and I was educated, and I look at that now and I know that in the civilian sector, that would be a lawsuit and it would be easy to win. You know what I mean? Like, that is unacceptable. If it happened to me, you got to know it was happening to lots of women, maybe more subtly. I actually think this was particularly egregious, but there's probably all sorts of things that are being taken away from women because they were pregnant or because they were mothers.
I talked to a gentleman who just got his doctorate in education, Mike McDowell, in episode 26. And he talked about, and I had not even considered this, he talked about how the fact that women were barred from combat positions for decades meant they were also completely barred from becoming the chief of staff of the Army. Yeah. Because those were infantry, those were special forces, those are people that had deployed and engaged in kinetic activity, because that's the Army's job, is to engage in kinetic activity. It makes me think also about women couldn't be combat pilots until, what was it, just after the Gulf War, I think it was the first time it was, because I think ironically it was the prior senator of Arizona. She actually sued the Air Force to allow her to fly combat missions. So good on her. But that means that they were also barred from being the chief of staff of the Air Force from 1945 or 1947 to 1993 or whatever it was. And I think a lot of people miss that the culture the military has created has been shaped by men for 50 plus years. And what we think is normal in the military is I mean, it felt normal to me because I don't get pregnant. Like, it felt normal to me because as a man in maintenance, nobody second guesses my call because I'm a man. That doesn't exist. That scenario doesn't exist.
But it feels normal to women too, because they work in the military, and that's the military culture, and you just kind of sort of come to accept it.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. I agree with you. I hope that your podcast gets enough followers, enough audience, not just for this episode, but for other episodes, but that someone really starts paying attention and starts making some changes that are long overdue. And I said it before. I mean, again, even with the pregnancy thing, I think there are a lot of opportunities. As a pregnant woman, I hated that I had to tell my command so early on in my pregnancy that I was pregnant. But if you're going to do that to women, then take care of them. Now you know they're pregnant. Yep. Take care of them. And if you find out that they've lost a pregnancy, take care of them.
Yep.
Because you have an opportunity to intervene there and to do something for them.
Yeah, I think that's important. Okay. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
I think that was just my final thought, is that we need to do better. We can do better, and we need to do better, and we should do better. We should start taking care of our women and appreciating their contributions.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to. So this is the first of the two-part I'm recording with Dr. Smith, and then I'll be recording the episode with the OBGYN. But I'm really interested to see the deep dive on the medical aspect, because then I think when these two episodes are married together, because I mean, we just explored the sort of social, mental, and emotional aspects of pregnancy in the military. And it's going to be really wild to see. Now let's look at the physical and how we treat women in the physical, both during the pregnancy and right after pregnancy. And I think when you marry these two episodes together, I think you'd be hard pressed to think that we treat women fairly at all.
Agreed. And that I know that to be true in other areas as well. It's a male dominated culture. And we've become too accustomed to letting it be that way.
I agree. Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for both addressing this topic professionally and personally. And obviously, if there's any questions that come of this in the comments, I'll make sure I forward them to you just so you can kind of see them. And if there's maybe a revisit in the future, I'll make sure I reach out. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Adios.
Bye.